Welcome to the dungeon. You're not here by choice, but don't worry, you're not alone. Tonight we descend gently into the quiet gloom of a medieval dungeon, the kind of place that once existed just beneath the surface of castles and cities, tucked away like a secret no one wanted to remember. The air is cool, thick with the scent of old stone and the faint iron tang of rust and time. A single torch crackles nearby, casting slow shadows that stretch and breathe against the walls, as if the place itself remembers what happened here. Welcome softly to the dungeon. This isn't the cartoonish version, with skeletons in chains and cobwebs you could swing from. It's quieter than that, more personal. The kind of darkness that doesn't scream, it just waits. This was not a place built for punishment alone, but for pause, for fear, for forgetting. Most people who ended up here weren't criminals in the way we think of them today. Maybe they spoke out of turn, maybe someone powerful got tired of their face, maybe they just owed the wrong person a chicken. The dungeon didn't care about guilt, it held people because it could. What makes medieval dungeons so quietly terrifying isn't the blood or the iron or the echoes, it's the intention. These spaces were designed to make you disappear, not in a dramatic way but in a slow fade. A sinking the world above carried on, merchants shouted, bells rang, feasts were held, and beneath it all people sat in silence, breathing the same breath over and over again, waiting for a door that didn't open. And yet were fascinated by them. We recreate them in books, in games, in films. There's something magnetic about the idea of a locked space of ancient justice handed down in cold stone and damp straw. But the truth is, most of us wouldn't last a day, not because of the chains or the rats, but because the noise in our minds would grow too loud without distraction. No phone, no light, no clock, just you, a wall, and the sound of dripping water counting the seconds wrong. So tonight we won't flinch from the dungeon. We'll explore it with quiet reverence, like a museum at midnight. There's no screaming, no horror, just history, heavy and echoing. Let your eyes adjust, let the shadows soften. The door is shut now, but you're safe, and together we'll learn why you really wouldn't survive a medieval dungeon, and why someone centuries ago probably already didn't. Arrested for what? You didn't need to bow villain to find yourself behind a dungeon door. In fact, villainy was optional, all it really took was timing. Maybe you brushed shoulders with the wrong noble on a crowded street and didn't apologize quickly enough. Maybe your neighbor's pig wandered into someone's garden, and now you're standing in front of a guard who's tired, very bored, and very willing to drag you down a set of narrow stone stairs just to make the paperwork interesting. The truth is, guilt wasn't a requirement. The medieval justice system was less about truth and more about influence, or its more familiar cousin, inconvenience. If someone of rank decided you were a problem, you became one. Did you owe someone money? Did you speak too loudly during Mass? Did you complain that bread prices had doubled again? Congratulations, you're a potential threat to order, and the order wants you quiet. A dungeon was less a prison and more a pause button, society's way of saying, well, deal with you later, and then promptly forgetting. Sometimes people ended up underground because they were in the wrong place when the trouble started. The innkeeper's son throws a punch. You sipping your ale peacefully in the corner are arrested because someone heard your name once and decided it sounded rebellious. Other times the charges were so vague they bordered on poetry disruption, insubordination, conduct unbecoming. One poor soul was once jailed for looking at the bishop in a manner unbefitting his station, whatever that means. There were, of course, laws, long ones. Some were carved into wood, others copied by hand in cramped Latin, but enforcement was personal. If the local lord thought you'd offended him, then you had. If a merchant accused you of theft and your tunic looked a little too new, that was probably enough. Trials came later, sometimes, other times, not at all. Some people spent weeks in a dungeon just waiting for someone to remember why they were there. Others waited years. Some weren't waiting for anything, they'd already been forgotten. And still, the town above would carry on. Bread was baked, bells were rung. Life kept moving while the dungeon stayed still. People might whisper your name in passing, then forget it by dinner. So no, you didn't need to be evil to land in a cell. You just needed to be unlucky or inconvenient or human on the wrong day. So if you're wondering what it took to wind up in a medieval dungeon, look around, say the wrong thing, wear the wrong cloak, frown at the wrong person's horse, and just like that, you're not part of the town anymore, you're part of the walls. The entrance is one. Way there was no grand doorway, no ominous sign above the threshold that read, "Abandon hope," or anything so dramatic. Just a door thick, wood swollen, with centuries of damp, studded with iron and regret. If it creaked open, it did so reluctantly, like even the dungeon itself wasn't entirely sure it wanted company. The entrance wasn't meant to be seen. It was tucked behind kitchens, beneath chapels, or at the base of forgotten towers, always below, always down. You didn't stumble across it, you were brought. A few uneven steps led to a passage that felt more like a throat than a hallway. Stone closed in on either side, rough and sweat slick from the years. The air changed the moment you descended, drier, colder, but also heavier, like it had no interest in rising. The light faded with every step. Not all dungeons were deep, but they were designed to feel that way. You could be 10 feet underground and still feel like the sky had been ripped away from you. There were no windows. That wasn't just practical, it was psychological. You weren't meant to know the hour or the weather or whether anyone up there remembered your name. Some cells were carved right into the bedrock. Others were nothing more than bricked. Up closets with a hole for air and another for waste. Both just wide enough to remind you that the world still existed, but not enough to reach it. You could scream, but no one would hear you, or worse, they would, and do nothing. Getting in was easy. You were marched, dragged, or shoved. The lock turned with a sound that wasn't sharp, but final, like a key settling into a promise. The cell door wasn't just a barrier, it was a ritual. One side meant air and motion and colour. The other side meant pause, cold, wet, and waiting. And getting out that depended on things that had nothing to do with justice. A trial, a bribe, a favour owed, a clerk misplacing your name. Sometimes people were freed, not because they were found innocent, but because someone needed the room, or because their jailer forgot what they were in for, and assumed time had served its own sentence. But the design always worked. The architecture didn't need chains to keep you still. It just needed to make you forget the feeling of forward. No light, no sound except your own breath, and maybe the drip of water that might not even be real. You came in walking. You left crawling, if you left at all. The dungeon wasn't meant to hold you forever, just long enough to change you. And in that quiet, echoing dark, it usually did. Meet the at least, not at first glance. No horns, no blood-stained hands, no manic grin, just a man with a heavy ring of keys, a thick belt that creaked when he walked, and a face carved by habit more than cruelty. He was the jailer, keeper of the quiet, the one who knew every name scratched into the walls, even the ones no one else remembered. He didn't need to raise his voice. The dungeon did that for him. People imagined jailers as sadistic, but the truth was often more mundane, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't interested in hurting you. He was interested in order. Lists, ledgers, routines, who had arrived, who had eaten, who hadn't. He kept track of debts, not just in coin, but in bread and favours. He knew which prisoner had a family that sent food, and which one was pretending. If he liked you, the soup was warm. If he didn't, it was water, and whatever floated in it. You didn't have to be good, just convenient. Bribes weren't always gold. A scrap of linen, a story well told, even a song could earn you a longer candle or a slightly drier corner. And if you were especially lucky, a smile. Not because he cared, but because it amused him. The jailer had seen too much to be moved by tears, but he was always watching. You weren't just a prisoner. You were part of the system he ran, and he ran it with the precision of a man who knew that mistakes meant noise, and noise was work. Some of them had been soldiers once. Others were just born near the wrong door and handed the job. They didn't write the laws. They didn't pass the sentences. They just turned the key. They were the middlemen of misery, but in their own strange way, they were also your best hope. A good jailer might pass a letter, might whisper news, might even forget to lock the door fully if the wine had been good that day, or if the roast at lunch made him sluggish. But a bad one, a cruel one, he didn't shout. He simply didn't come. He let the food skip a day. He let the bucket overflow. He let your name slip lower and lower on the page, until it was easier to stop writing it at all. So yes, meet the jailer. He's not what you expect. He's more dangerous because of it. He holds the keys, but not just to the doors. To your future, to your sanity, to whether you're seen as human or a number in the dark. And as you sit there, listening to the echo of his boots fading down the corridor, you can't help but wonder, what kind of lunch did he have today? The cell that wasn't a cell. It wasn't a room. Not really. There were no clean-cut corners or iron bars spaced evenly like a cage. No straw neatly piled in the corner. No cot, no window. No sense that this was a space made for a human at all. Because it wasn't what you called a cell. Was often whatever bit of ground hadn't caved in yet. A crevice in the earth, a sunken storage space no longer used for grain, a half-collapsed crypt with bones that didn't all belong to you. In the stories, dungeons have doors, proper ones, with locks and keys and maybe even a tiny window to pass food through. But in truth, many prisoners were lowered into places where the only door was gravity. A rope, sometimes, a ladder, rarely. Often, you were just dropped into a pit dug decades ago and forgotten until someone needed to be kept somewhere. The well had dried up. Perfect. The basement had a patch of floor too soft for barrels. Throw someone on it. There was little rhyme or reason, just space, just stone, just silence. The ground was always damp, even in summer. Mold grew in the corners, and whatever creatures lived there before. You didn't always leave. You shared your cell with beetles, spiders, and sometimes worse. Things with fur and teeth that didn't care about your sentence. The air didn't circulate, so it turned stale quickly, thick with breath and decay. It smelled like the past, and not the kind you tell stories about. The kind you bury, and you weren't always alone. These weren't solitary cells, just solitary experiences. You might be crammed in with 2 others, or 10. Some too quiet, some too loud, some already broken. You learned to take up less space, to breathe shallowly, to keep your back to the wall if there was one. You hoped the pit didn't flood. You hoped no one got sick, because in a place like that, sickness wasn't an event, it was an atmosphere. There was no routine, only waiting. Light came in flickers, when the door above opened, when a torch passed by. Long hours blurred into each other. You could measure time by how long it took the drip from the ceiling to form a puddle, or how many times you counted the same cracks in the stone. And still you waited. So no, the cell wasn't a cell. It was a space. The world had stopped needing until it needed to forget you. A hole in the ground with a human shape, slowly carved into it, day by day, your body, your breath, and your silence. Roommates you didn't choose. There's no such thing as privacy in a medieval dungeon. Not really. If you were lucky, you got a corner. If you were unlucky, you became someone else's corner. Space was a suggestion, and boundaries were imaginary. You didn't get to choose who lay beside you, who coughed through the night, or who muttered things best left untranslated. You were simply placed among others like objects stored in a cellar, lined up, piled on, and slowly forgotten. Some were loud, some were silent, some stared at nothing, and blinked only when the torchlight flickered. There was always one who talked too much, usually to no one in particular. And always someone who thought 3 a.m. was the perfect time for a hymn. Half-remembered Latin, echoing through the damp, turning the whole dungeon into a broken cathedral. You couldn't sleep through it, you couldn't stop it. You just listened, eyelids, heavy brain drifting somewhere between exhaustion and delirium, as Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus bounced off the stone like a lullaby from a different century. The real roommates, though, were smaller. Rats didn't ask permission. They moved with confidence, fur slick and eyes bright, weaving through bodies like they belonged there. Because they did this was their home long before it was yours. They knew which puddles were clean enough to drink from, which bits of bread had fallen through the cracks, and which prisoners wouldn't kick them away anymore. Fleas were less polite. You didn't see them, you just felt them, the itch, the welts, the knowledge that whatever was crawling on you was also crawling on everyone else. And then sometimes there was plague. No fanfare, no warning, one cellmate would shiver a little more than usual. Sweat would replace speech, then the smell would change. The jailer might notice or not. Maybe they'd drag the body out, maybe not. It didn't matter, the rest of you had already shared the air, the straw, the bite of the same rat illness. Wasn't a visitor in the dungeon, it was part of the staff. But despite it all, the stink, the sound, the sickness, something strange could happen. A kind of fragile fellowship. You shared stories in whispers, laughed when someone farted too loudly, passed along a crumb of bread like it was gold. You gave each other names even if they weren't real. You memorized each other's faces in the dark because it made the time feel less empty. It wasn't friendship, not really, but it was something. So you learned to live together in that cramped pocket of the world where the rules had cracked and peeled away, where the worst part wasn't the darkness but the closeness, and also maybe the Latin, because even now, even in memory, you can still hear it, that one verse off-key and endless, as if someone believed heaven might hear them through the stone. Meals on no wheels. The hunger didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly at first, like the colder missed meal here. A smaller bite there. You told yourself you weren't that hungry. You could wait. You'd eaten yesterday. Or was it the day before time bent in the dark? Eventually your body stopped, expecting it just ate. In a medieval dungeon, food was never guaranteed. There was no kitchen staff wheeling trays of porridge, no scheduled meal times, no certainty at all. If you were someone with friends, family, or coin, maybe you received something, a crust wrapped in chew but soft enough to suck. If not, then you waited, and then you starved. The jailer might bring you a bowl of something. He didn't have to, but sometimes he did. It was never warm abroth that had long since forgotten. It was ever soup, a mash of beans and water that smelled faintly of feet. You didn't ask what it was, you ate it, because the alternative was worse, and even that depended on whether he liked you, or if he'd eaten well himself, or if the person above you on the list had nent down a few extra coins, and suddenly your bowl didn't exist anymore. Water came in buckets, stale, tinted with whatever had touched the walls before it, thick some days, thin on others. If you were lucky, it tasted like metal, if not like mold. You didn't drink quickly, you sipped slow and cautious, pretending the grit at the bottom wasn't there. The worst part was after long enough, it still quenched your thirst. Your standards dropped, your body adjusted, and that, in a way, was the most terrifying part. Sometimes food arrived too late, bread so green with fuzz, it looked like moss cheese, so hard it might been stone. You picked around the rot if you could, you pretended not to see the worm hunger, blurred the edges of disgusts. Eventually it erased them. There were stories of prisoners chewing straw, boiling leather, catching rats, not to kill them but to cook them. These weren't dramatic acts of survival, they were quiet, patient, the kind of choices made in the dark, with no audience. You didn't do it to prove anything, you did it because your stomach had forgotten how to stop asking. So when we talk about prison diets, we're not talking about meals, we're talking about absence, about the space where food should have been, about the slow unraveling of a body that still hoped, even when the bowl didn't come. You didn't eat in the dungeon, you endured, and even when something did arrive, it wasn't nourishment, it was a reminder that you were still alive, but only just. Torture wasn't always physical. It wasn't the pain that broke most people. It was the waiting, the stillness, the not knowing a day without light. Then another, a voice outside the door that doesn't speak your name, the creak of footsteps that pass you by. That's the real torment, not the rack or the rope, but the slow, silent grind of time against your mind. You see, torture in the dungeon didn't always come with blood. It didn't need to. The walls did the work. The quiet did the rest. There was no clock to count the hours, no sunbeam to trace across the floor, just darkness, sometimes complete, sometimes flickering like the flame was thinking about leaving too. You didn't know how long you'd been there. You only knew you weren't where you once were, and you weren't getting out soon. Some days nothing happened, and that was the worst part. No one came, no one spoke, no verdict, no punishment, no plan. Just your breath, your heartbeat, your thoughts, and they weren't always kind. They'd whisper things that this was forever, that no one was looking for you, that you were being kept here because someone had already decided you weren't worth remembering. There were no screams, not in the way people imagine. What echoed more often was a kind of emptiness. A cough, maybe the scrape of someone's boot, a prayer mumbled over and over until the words lost shape, or the sound of someone trying not to cry, quiet, careful, as if even their sorrow might get them in trouble. The real torment was subtle. It was the absence of sound, not the presence of pain. And the fear wasn't of what they would do. It was fear of not knowing if they would. That door might open with a torch and 2 guards, or it might stay closed another week. You might be dragged upstairs, or you might just rot. No one told you, no one explained, and the longer the silence lasted, the more your imagination took over, and it never made things better. Minds, after all, are very good at finding darkness in the dark. You could be in the dungeon for days, or months, or longer. Some people came out changed, not because they were beaten, but because they had lived too long in a space where time had no shape and hope had no voice. They emerged blinking, not just from the light, but from the strangeness of being spoken to again, being seen. So no, torture wasn't always a tool with teeth. Sometimes it was just a room with no window, a silence that never stopped, a future that refused to show its face. And it worked because a person doesn't need to be touched to be torn apart. They just need to be left alone long enough to do it to themselves. The actual torture bits. Let's talk about the part everyone imagines. First, the torture devices, the spikes and screws, the stretching and squeezing the iron instruments with names that sound like nursery rhymes whispered by someone you shouldn't trust it. But tonight, well, approach them, not with horror, but with curiosity, performances written in iron. Take the rack, for example, a long wooden frame with rollers, at either end ropes tied to wrists and ankles. It wasn't just about pulling someone apart. It was about turning a person into a question. How far could they be stretched before they answered, before they broke? And the real answer most times was sooner than you'd think. Not because of the pain, but because of the anticipation. People confessed. Before the ropes even moved, the rack didn't need to shout, it just needed to wait. Or the thumb screws, small, almost delicate, like something you might find in a carpenter's toolbox. A little metal device that clamped down slowly until bones whispered their secrets. The point wasn't destruction, it was control, small pressure, precise fear, a quiet way to say we are listening and we will keep listening until you tell us what we want to hear. Then there's the pear, an odd little instrument shaped surprisingly like a fruit, hinged at the center, designed to expand. It sounds almost comical until you consider where it was meant to go. But let's not dwell there. What matters is that it was less about function and more about spectacle. These were not tools of truth. They were theatre. They didn't extract justice. They displayed power. Look what we can do to a body that does not obey. And that's the heart of it. Torture, for all its terror, wasn't usually about information. It was about silence, about making sure people didn't ask the wrong questions again. These devices were warnings in physical form, ornate, exaggerated, designed to linger in the imagination longer than in the flesh. Many were rarely used, if at all, but they were always shown. That was the point. So tonight we don't need to flinch. We can look at these twisted tools not as nightmares, but as artist's proof of a time when fear was made of wood and iron and kept on display, not to protect the world, but to remind it who held the keys. In the soft dark of now, it's enough to know they existed, and to remember that sometimes the sharpest weapon in the room wasn't the rack or the screw, it was the silence that followed, and the understanding that tomorrow it could be you. Confess or rot. Confession was the goal, not truth, not clarity, just a statement, preferably one that matched the story already written. For you, in the logic of medieval justice, guilt wasn't something uncovered, it was something confirmed, and the easiest way to confirm it, ask the accused politely at first. If you confessed, things could move forward. Records could be written, punishments scheduled. Officials satisfied. Everyone liked a confession. It made things simpler, cleaner. But the strange thing was, even if you gave them what they wanted, even if you whispered through cracked lips that yes, you did it, it didn't mean you were spared. In fact, it usually meant the opposite, because now there was no doubt. Sometimes confessing meant a quick execution instead of a long one, a hanging instead of fire. but other times it simply meant more questions. Who helped you? Who knew who else should be sitting where you're sitting now? And if your confession wasn't convincing enough, if it didn't come with enough detail or remorse, they'd start over a better confession, a fuller one, as if guilt was a story that needed perfect punctuation. And if you didn't confess, if you held your silence, even through the dark and the cold and the slow grind of fear, then you stayed, you rotted. Not metaphorically, literally, cells were not made for time. They were made for waiting, so you waited while your muscles forgot movement, while your skin thinned, while your name faded from memory. No verdict, no trial, just the space between accusations. Sometimes there'd come check. Ask again, maybe this time you'd say yes just to be seen again, just to move forward even toward the end. That's how powerful the system was. It could make death feel like mercy. Because in the twisted logic of the dungeon, time was the sharpest tool. They didn't need to break you quickly. They just needed to wait for the moment your voice cracked open like old wood, and once it did, they'd write it down, seal it with wax, and move on. The words didn't need to be true, they just needed to be yours. So no confessing didn't save you, it just changed the shape of the story from a question, with no end to a sentence with a period, and maybe if you were lucky a gravestone, if not just bones in the earth under someone else's name. That was justice then, not a search for what happened, but a ritual to make sure no one asked again, and all it needed was your voice, even if it wasn't really yours anymore. Prison as a business. There was nothing free about prison, not even the misery behind the damp walls and rusted locks was a quiet little economy ticking along like a mold-covered clock. Someone had to pay for the straw, the bucket, the scraps of food, and that someone more often than not was you. Being thrown into a dungeon didn't mean you stopped existing on paper, quite the opposite. The moment you were locked in, you started costing money, and the jailer, always the practical sort, wasn't about to foot the bill, so he kept records, neat ones, if he was the organized type. Your name, your crime, your cell, and importantly your tab. If you were wealthy, or if someone outside still cared enough to send coin, your stay could be bearable. Maybe you got a corner near the door where the air was slightly less stale. Maybe a few extra rags to keep the chill off. Bread that wasn't rock-hard, water that didn't shimmer with things that shouldn't be in it. You might even have a candle, short, stumpy, and precious. Light was expensive, and so was hope. But if you couldn't pay, if your purse was as empty as your stomach, then you got the floor. Not all of it, just the bit no one else wanted. The damp patch near the wall, the spot where water pooled after rain. You learned to sleep curled, not stretched, to keep the wet from soaking your bones. You drank what was given, you begged for the rest. And, yes, you could borrow. The jailer might front you some bread, some warmth, the sliver of space not claimed by rats. But everything added to your debt, and your debt added to your sentence. Even if you were cleared of wrongdoing, you might not walk free until your bill was paid, which meant waiting, or hoping someone on the outside still remembered your name. Some dungeons had better rooms, old storehouses with dry stone or a tiny view of the sky. They cost more naturally, and there were always people willing to pay. Nobles, clergy, merchants with influence. You in your threadbare shift were simply in the way, so you moved, not with force but with fees, room by room, corner by corner, until you found yourself exactly where your coin had run out. So yes, prison was a business. It ran on guilt, on silence, and on silver. And for those without any of the above, it was a long, slow decline into the part of the dungeon that even light forgot. You didn't just pay for survival, you rented dignity by the hour, and some days you simply couldn't afford it. Escape plans almost always failed. It always started the same way with hope, a quiet whisper shared between cellmates, a scratch in the stone. No one would notice a plan built on stolen minutes and shaky confidence, because no matter how deep the dungeon, someone was always dreaming of a way out. They tried everything, digging with spoons when spoons could be found, chipping away at ancient mortar with a piece of bone, a stolen nail, or even a sharpened rock, one scrape at a time, always at night, always holding their breath. The sound of stone on stone echoed more than you'd think, and silence had ears in every direction. Some tried bribery. A guard with a drinking habit might be convinced to leave a door unlatched or to look the other way for just a moment too long. But it was a delicate game. Bribe the wrong man, and you'd lose more than coin. You'd lose your chance, your rations, or your place on the list of those still remembered by name. Others faked illness, collapsed in the dark, hoping to be moved somewhere less secure, to an infirmary perhaps, or a transport wagon. But the jailers had seen it all before. A little blood, a little shaking, not enough, and if you faked too well you might end up buried just to save them the trouble. There were stories, always stories of someone who made it. A thin boy who slipped between the bars, a former soldier who used his chains to pry the hinges off a rotting door, a clever woman who mimicked the jailer's handwriting and wrote her own release order tales, passed around like treasures, whispered from cell to cell. Most of them weren't true, but they gave people something to hold. The truth, almost no one escaped dungeons, weren't made for motion. They were made to forget you. The staircases turned in strange angles. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams, and thick enough to stop digging. Even if you got out of your cell, you still had to get through the corridors, then the gate, then the guards, then the town, and all while half-starved, half-limping with a face known to every watchman. And if you were caught, the punishment wasn't more time, it was less care, fewer meals, colder nights, a message written in hunger, don't try again. Still, people did, because even the smallest cell couldn't lock away imagination, because hope, stubborn as it is, tends to survive longer than sense, and so the tunnels kept being dug, the doors kept being tested, the stories kept being whispered. Not because escape was likely, but because believing in it, even for a moment, was a kind of freedom all its own. The noble treatment. Not all dungeon stays were created equal. While most prisoners curled up on wet stone and listened to rats squabble over crumbs, some rested their heads on feather pillows. Not metaphorically, actual down-filled pillows. The kind that smelled faintly of lavender instead of mildew, because if you had the right name, the right title, or just enough coin, prison could look surprisingly comfortable. A noble cell might be on the upper floor where the air still moved and the light visited from time to time. The door might not even lock, at least not loudly. There could be a rug on the floor, a table for writing letters, even a small fireplace if you were especially well connected. Food didn't arrive in wooden bowls, but on plates with utensils, napkins, and sometimes wine. Yes, wine in prison. Some cells were called apartments in the records. It sounds absurd now, but back then it was simply practical. A duke, after all, couldn't be expected to share a pit with a pickpocket, and the jailer, clever man that he was, knew who paid the bills, so accommodations were made at Tapestry to cover the worst of the stone a servant allowed to visit, a bath brought in on feast days. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't despair either. And yet, for those without means, the contrast was more than cruel. It was insult wrapped in injustice. While one prisoner sipped watered-down claret by candlelight, another sat waist-deep in mud, watching their fingernails go black from cold. You might hear music from the upper cells, smell roasting meat, know with painful certainty that someone upstairs had committed a worse crime, but committed it with status. Sometimes nobles even brought pets. Cats, small dogs, a favourite bird. The animals weren't prisoners, of course they were just visiting, and that somehow made it worse. Watching a dog stretch luxuriously by the fire while you shared a straw mat with lice, but complaining did nothing. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. Of course, noble treatment didn't always last. A shift in power, a lost favour, a king's temper, and suddenly the pillows vanished, the tapestries were taken down, and the cell felt much smaller, but for a while at least the dungeon could feel more like a stern guest house than a prison. So yes, you could survive the dungeon, even thrive in it if you brought your own blankets, but only if you arrived wearing silk for everyone else. The accommodations were simpler stone straw and the company of mould, because in the end what mattered wasn't guilt or innocence or even law. It was linen count, and if you didn't have enough threads to your name, you didn't get warmth, you got wet. Executions were public, not private. Dying in the dungeon was quiet, slow. It came in the shape of starvation or sickness, with no audience and no applause. But for many the dungeon wasn't the end. It was just the waiting room. The real conclusion happened outside in the sunlight in front of a crowd that had brought bread and children and maybe a song or two, because executions weren't private affairs. Theatre, a final act, with you at the cent. Whether you were ready or not, the dungeon prepared you not just physically but mentally. It stripped you of time, of names, of any sharp edges your pride might have had. By the time they opened the door and called your name, you were hollowed out, an empty figure in borrowed rags, blinking at the brightness like it was a foreign thing, and in a way it was sunlight had become a stranger. They didn't always tell you the day. That was part of the ritual. Uncertainty made you quieter, more obedient, so when they finally came you stumbled up the stairs, bones creaking legs, remembering how to walk. The guards didn't speak. They didn't need to. This part had been rehearsed 100 times, even if you hadn't known it. The square was already waiting, children on shoulders, merchants leaning from stalls. There were always those who claimed they didn't enjoy it, that they came only because it was happening. But the truth is, everyone watched. Executions were a kind of punctuation. They reminded the town how things worked, who had power, who didn't, and what happened when you crossed the wrong line. If you were lucky, it was the rope. Quick, almost clean. If you were unlucky, it was the axe, handled by a man who had practiced less than he claimed. Sharp axes dulled quickly, and sharpening took time, and time especially for the condemned wasn't always afforded, so the blow might land poorly. Or again and again the crowd flinched, but only slightly. Then they went back to eating. Your name would be shouted, your crimes announced. Some listened, others didn't. Your words, if you spoke, were rarely remembered. It wasn't your story anymore, it was theirs, a shared event, something to talk about while walking home. Did you see how pale he looked? They say she confessed at the end. I heard it took 3 swings. And when it was done, the crowd would part, the body taken away, the blood covered with straw, the stage reset for another day. Life went on. It always did. But the dungeon never left you. Not really. Because it wasn't the execution that killed you. That part was just spectacle. What truly ended you came long before, in the silence, in the dark, in the slow erosion of being forgotten. The square was just the final scene. The dungeon wrote the script. Forgotten by everyone, some people didn't die in the square, or the cell, or even the record books. They just disappeared. Not all at once, not dramatically, just gradually, like a candle burning out in a room. No one visits anymore. These were the forgotten ones. The ones whose names faded before their voices did, whose bones stayed curled where breath had once been, tucked in corners that hadn't felt sunlight in years. It didn't happen out of cruelty, not exactly, more out of neglect, or the simple turning of the world, a scribe misplacing a document, a noble dying before signing a pardon, a new jailer not bothering to count how many prisoners were supposed to be there. And so a man arrested for suspicion, or for being poor in the wrong alleyway, might simply never be called again. His case not closed, just ignored. Time in the dungeon wasn't marked by calendars. There were no seasons, no holidays, just slow changes. The stone grew colder, then warmer, then cold again. Mold changed color. The drip of water from the ceiling gained a rhythm you could hum along to if you still had the will. Your body changed too, thinner, quieter, slower to react. Wounds took longer. Hunger felt duller. At some point, you stopped being awake or asleep and just existed somewhere in between. And it was quiet, not always silent. Dungeons breathed in their own way, but it was a kind of quiet that got into your bones. You'd listen for footsteps that never came, voices that weren't speaking to you. You'd wait for someone to remember, a name called down the corridor, a door creaking open just for you. But nothing came. Eventually you forgot too. What day it was, what year, what you were even accused of, your own face, if no reflection could be found. You stopped checking the door. You stopped hoping, not in a dramatic way but softly, the same way you forget dreams a few minutes after waking. They were real, but now they're gone. Some were found years later, skeletal, silent, sitting up against a wall like they'd just paused for a moment. Others were never found at all, just bones buried under newer bricks, sealed behind forgotten doors. Their stories ended without punctuation, not tragic, not heroic, just quiet. And the dungeon didn't care, it didn't mourn. It simply moved on, stone by stone, shadow by shadow. New prisoners came. Old ones faded. Names were scratched into walls beside others that no longer made sense. And somewhere deep within, someone waited still. Not for freedom, not even for death, but for the sound of footsteps that meant they hadn't been completely erased. To be forgotten is not the same as to be gone. It's slower, softer, but in many ways it's worse. Because at least the executed, the forgotten, simply stopped being seen. And in the dark, with no voice to echo them back, they stopped seeing themselves. Famous dungeon survivors, not everyone vanished in the dark. A few, a rare few, crawled back into the light, blinking, broken, but alive. And some of them remarkably wrote it all down, not for revenge, not always for justice, but because if you survive the dungeon, your mind needs somewhere to put it. Words were a kind of exhale, a way to carry the weight without letting it crush you. One of the most well-known was Francois Villon, the French poet and thief, who danced between prison cells and gallows, like it was a game he refused to lose. His verses dripped with dark humour, but behind them was the unmistakable scrape of iron and the memory of cold straw. He knew the sound of a cell door closing too well, and he wrote with the urgency of someone who never expected to be free. Then there was John Gerard, a Jesuit priest imprisoned in the Tower of London. He hung by a rope from a window, hands torn and raw, escaping across the moat, with the help of allies who believed in something bigger than fear. His memoirs read like something between scripture and spy novel. But it wasn't the daring that haunted, it was the silence between each event. The long hours before and after, the waiting. Always the waiting. Marco Polo too wrote his travels while in a Genoese prison. Though his cell was likely more pleasant than most, more writing desk than oubliette, it still carried that same strange truth. Even the well-born could be locked away. His fantastical tales blurred the line between memory and myth, but perhaps that was the point. After prison, reality itself feels optional. Even Casanova, yes, the lover, the schemer, famously broke out of the Leeds, the Venetian prison beneath the Doge's palace. His escape involved bribery, disguise, and a bit of absurd luck. But his writings suggest that the hardest part wasn't climbing through the ceiling. It was waiting in the dark, not knowing if it would work, or if anyone still remembered who he was. What these stories show beyond the cleverness or resilience is how thin the line was between surviving and disappearing. For every voice that returned, hundreds stayed silent. These survivors went the rule. They were the anomaly, the exception that proved just how brutal the norm was. And yet they remind us that sometimes, against all reason, a door does open, a rope does hold, a guard looks the other way, and a person long buried by stone and silence walks back into the world and says, "I was there, I lived." Their stories are maps drawn in candlelight, wobbly worn, but still pointing towards something important, that even in the deepest dark a voice, however cracked, might still find its way out. The plague arrives. When the plague crept into towns like a shadow with teeth, no one was truly safe. Streets, emptied doors shut, candles burned for the lost before they were even cold. And in the chaos people looked to the dungeons with pity or perhaps relief. After all, what more could happen to those already buried? The truth was stranger than most expected. Dungeons were in many ways perfect breeding grounds for disease. Cramped, airless, filthy water sat stagnant. Rats came and went without invitation, and yet, oddly, not every dungeon was wiped clean by the Black Death. Some were spared, not because they were clean, but because they were already cut off. The very isolation that made them cruel sometimes made them safe. The guards grew sick, the scribes too. Food delivery stopped or slowed or came with trembling hands. Entire towns locked themselves in, and the dungeons, lo, a purity already hidden, were forgotten. Even further, which meant that some prisoners trapped in their darkness had no contact with the plagueiders, but also no fresh air, no spectre cloth. It wasn't mercy, just a tragic twist of logistics, but it meant that in a few cases the only ones left alive after a wave of plague were the ones who had been shut away, the people buried before the funeral began. Other times the disease did find its way, in one scratch, one bite, one guard coughing as he locked the door, and then the dungeon became what everyone feared it might, a slow-motion grave. The sick couldn't flee, the dying had no hands to comfort them, the walls did not care. Sometimes entire cells went silent within days. Sometimes the infected were bricked in the doors, sealed forever. Just a wall now, a space no longer counted, and still the dungeon held its breath and waited for the world above to decide whether it had remembered it or not. There's a strange irony in it, that the place designed to destroy you might, under certain twisted conditions, save you, that rot and ruin could protect, not because they were kind, but because they were already so completely severed from life. The dungeon was outside the rhythms of the town, and for a brief, awful time that made it a shelter. When the plague receded and keys were found again, some doors were opened to reveal corpses, others to faces pale and blinking, shocked to find they had survived what the world above could not. So yes, the dungeon could be a tomb, but it could also be a cocoon, not by design, never by kindness, just by accent, just by absence, and in that silence even the plague sometimes forgot to knock. Dungeon lore and legend, even in the darkest places, stories found a way in. They clung to the damp stones and echoed through the corridors soft as breath. Stories of ghosts that never stopped pacing, of chains that rattled with no hands to pull them, of voices whispering names no one remembered writing down. Every dungeon had its legends, not carved into the walls, but passed from one terrified prisoner to the next, like a charm or a curse. Some said certain cells were cursed, not because bad things happened there, that was every cell, but because people heard things in them, whispers, scratching, the gentle tap of fingers on stone when no one else was near. There was always one corner of the dungeon colder than the rest, where the straw never stayed dry, and the rats never ventured. That's where the ghost lived, they said, usually a monk or a noble, or someone wrongly accused, doomed to spend eternity in a cell meant for someone else. And, of course, there were tunnels, always tunnels. Hidden routes dug by desperate hands or designed by clever architects who feared becoming prisoners themselves. Tunnels beneath wells, behind crumbling bricks, under loose stones in the floor. Most were imaginary, but it didn't matter. They gave prisoners something to search for, a reason to count stones, to knock on walls, to hope, and once in a while, just often enough to keep the legends alive. Someone claimed they heard air moving where it shouldn't, or found a brick that gave a little too easily. There were stories of jailers who made deals with the devil, of bells that rang without wind, of entire rooms where time moved differently, a man entering at 20 and leaving at 40 with no memory of the in-between. There were tales of eyes watching from cracks in the wall, never blinking, of bloodstains that returned no matter how often they were scrubbed. Were they true? Probably not. But truth mattered less than belief in the dungeon. When the days had no shape and the nights stretched endlessly, stories gave the shadows edges. They made the silence bearable, even beautiful in a strange way. New prisoners always said they didn't believe, scoffed at the idea of a ghost in a place already full of living misery. But after a few weeks, after the first time they heard breathing where no one lay, they grew quieter. After all, it was easier to believe the cell was haunted than to admit the sound came from your own imagination. So yes, the dungeon had its legends. Not to scare you, but to hold you, like a lullaby made of stone and fear. Something to listen to when the real horrors had quieted for the night. Something to remind you that even here, where everything was forgotten, stories still survived. The slow end of dungeons didn't disappear with a bang. There was no dramatic vote, no sudden enlightenment where someone stood up and declared, "This is inhumane." Like most things in history, their end came slowly. A quiet unraveling pulled thread by shifting laws, changing minds, and the creeping realization that locking someone in a hole might not be the peak of justice. It started, oddly enough, with paper records, complaints, expenses. Keeping a dungeon wasn't just morally grim, it was expensive. Food had to be delivered. Guards had to be paid, or at least bribed. Sick prisoners became everyone's problem, especially when disease didn't respect stone walls. And so, as towns grew and rulers began worrying more about appearances than vengeance, questions started to surface. Do we really need a jail under every castle? Do we want visitors walking past the smell? There were reforms, though they came in fits and starts. Some towns replaced dungeons with holding cells. Not much better, but at least above ground. Others built galls. Early prisons meant less for punishment and more for holding people while they awaited trial. A slight improvement, you might still sleep on stone, but now someone might come check on you. Eventually, philosophers began whispering strange things. That punishment should fit the crime. That justice meant fairness, not fear. These ideas took time to spread, longer still to be believed, but once they did, the image of the dungeon began to shift. From necessary to archaic, from justice to cruelty, from order to something vaguely embarrassing. By the 17th and 18th centuries, many dungeons had simply been abandoned, sealed up, repurposed. Some became wine cellars, others museums. A few were just left to rot, their ghosts left pacing alone. Prisons didn't disappear, of course, but they moved out of the earth and into buildings, with windows, with rules, with slightly more attention paid to whether or not you were alive. And still traces remained. The idea of forgetting someone on purpose, of silence as punishment, of justice being something you endure rather than experience. These didn't vanish. They just changed clothes. You can still visit some of the old places, walk down the narrow staircases, feel the air thicken, see the walls scratched with initials, prayers, madness. The tour guide will speak softly, and you'll be told how terrible it was and how far we've come. But dungeons didn't end because we became kinder overnight. They ended because they stopped making sense, because someone did the math and realized that fear wasn't efficient, and in a world slowly learning to value appearances over pain, that was enough. So the doors stayed shut, the torches went out, and the darkness at last was left alone. Not because we finally knew better, just because we finally chose to look elsewhere. Dreaming of the sunlight, imagine it. The heavy door creaks open, not with urgency, but with the careful uncertainty of someone who isn't quite sure what they'll find. A figure stands in the doorway, silhouetted against something impossibly bright. You blink, instinctively turning away, because your eyes aren't used to this much world. Someone says your name, your real name, not the one they muttered when bringing stale bread or scribbling on a forgotten ledger. It sounds strange, like a word you once knew in another life. You try it out in your head a few times before answering, just to be sure it's still yours. Then the air hits you, and it's sharp. Not foul or thick or laced with mildew, but fresh, alive. The kind of air that moves across fields and rivers before finding your face. You take a breath, and it surprises you. There's space in your lungs again. Your ribs stretch like they're remembering how. Step by step, the stone underfoot grows warmer, softer. There's no need to duck anymore. The ceiling has given way to sky, the kind that seems too blue to be real, like it's been waiting just for you. You're not the same, of course. No one leaves a dungeon untouched. Time folds differently down there. But that doesn't mean you're broken, just reshaped. Like water finding a new path around stone. You've carried silence, learned its weight, and now every sound, birds, voices, footsteps on grass, feels like music. You pause. The light is on your face now fully, not torchlight. Not the yellow flicker of fire pressed into damp walls, but sunlight, real sunlight. And it doesn't just illuminate, it warms. People may stare, some in pity, some in curiosity, but others, just a few, will nod, quietly. Because they've known darkness too, maybe not in cells and chains, but in other ways. And they'll recognize something in you. Not what you went through, but that you came through. You won't run. You won't cry. You'll just stand there for a long moment, letting the world fill in around you. The sound of trees moving in the wind, a dog barking somewhere far off, a breeze against the back of your neck. Things that never existed in the dungeon, but now feel almost too rich to hold. And then you'll walk, not fast, but forward. Because the past may be stone and shadow and silence, but the future smells like grass, warmed by morning. It hums, it opens. Not all history is horror. Some of it is survival. Some of it is the quiet triumph of a person who, against all odds, gets to feel sunlight again and dares to dream under it.